Perfectly arranged. You put the glass of water there. Well
Oh,
done.
yes. That's the least that we can do, really. We're not fancy here, but...
Oh, I think this looks pretty fancy.
Everyone always gets very quiet when you ask them to
Yes.
don't they?
Yes.
Everyone
That's all
always
right.
gets really, really hushed. Which is really quiet. You can talk amongst yourselves for a second.
Well, we get ourselves organised. Yeah, we do the shuffle of getting
Do
all
the
sorted.
shuffle. Let us get ready. Let us get the right page up on our iPads, at least, for goodness sake. Now, I should say before we get started, these are pretend microphones. They don't actually work.
It's not switched.
Well, at least it doesn't work for you, but it's very, very good for the podcast later on, hence why we'll be using them this evening. But no, it's not going to project. But if you can't hear us, I think you probably can, but if you can't hear us, just let us know and we'll talk a little bit louder. So if we do have any questions at the end, I'll be passing this microphone around, because you will need to use it, otherwise we'll just get dead silence. So to start with, just a little bit of notes. As you can see, we do have a camera in the middle so that we can add this to the podcast YouTube trouble later on. So do just be a little bit careful around that. Don't give it a kick or anything. We'd really appreciate it. I spent ages trying to line it up. So that would be really, really lovely if you didn't do that. If you'd like to post about this evening on social media, you're more than welcome to. Please just tag us at Trouble. If you could mention the incredible book, if you could tag Baroness Bennett. And of course, if you could mention this frankly ridiculously gorgeous venue that we're in this evening, X and Y. It is absolutely lovely. We're so lucky to be here. So to X and Y, thank you so, so much for having us. And I don't know how you get any work done with this view, frankly. It's ridiculous. Anyway, without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome back to the Trouble Club, now in Manchester, former leader of the Green Party, House of Lords peer, and the author of Change Everything, Baroness Natalie Bennett of Manor Castle. Thank you so much for joining us at the Trouble Club this evening.
And it's lovely to be back at the Trouble Club.
Making trouble once again. Can't get enough of us, clearly.
It's the absolute natural place for me to be.
I was about to say, would you consider yourself to be a troublemaker?
Oh, absolutely, yes, totally and utterly. In fact, not so long ago, the accent comes from Australia, if you haven't picked it out by now, and I went to a fee-paying private school because I got a scholarship, and they actually had a school reunion, which I hosted at the House of Lords a couple of months ago, and it was really quite funny because I was telling all the transgressive things I did in my school days, and particularly all of the younger, recently graduated ones were just like, wow, we love it, it's great. And I was like, I'm not sure I should be, oh yes, of course I'm doing this.
I love your school probably was like, oh, you'll never amount to anything, troublemaker like that, you'll never go anywhere, and yet you find yourself in the House of Lords today.
Well, I was as a 17-year-old, I was selected by the teachers. We didn't have elections to be a prefect. And I refused to be a prefect because I didn't believe in the school rules. And, that caused a storm at the time. And it was just a little bit, sort of pompous, I'd have to say now, but it was quite fun.
Which rules in particular did you object to?
Oh, we had lots and lots of ridiculous rules. I mean, you think Australian summer, we had to wear tights. And so you would, have a sports training session after school, 35 degrees, and then you had to put tights on to go home.
That's inhumane.
Yes, I thought so too.
That's torture. That's awful. Well, quite right. Good for objecting on that front, because that is hideous. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to dive in. I mean, this is something that just immediately stood out to me from the book. In the UK, we are using our share of the resources of 3 planets every single year. That is one of the stats from the book here, and might help to explain the title because it's not vague. It is Change Everything. Not just like we need to tweak a little things. It's like, no, we've got to change everything. So tell us about why you went for that phenomenally unvague title.
Well, because that's what we want to do. But I think that figure that you picked out about 3-planet living, and, America is 4-planet living. And the thing is, just run a little thought experiment. Imagine that we'd create a wonderful society where there was no poverty, where every child was in school and not being shoved out of school because it was going to put down the school's exam results, where everyone had a warm, comfortable, affordable to heat home, where there were no food banks. We really shouldn't rest until the last food bank closes because of lack of demand. Imagine we had that society, and then the scientists came out and said, oh, there's a climate emergency. We're going to have to change everything. Now, that would be really politically difficult. But actually, where we are now, we are both trashing the planet and creating a thoroughly miserable society. So what I'm talking about is, people, I think less now than they used to go, oh, well, we'll get on to sorting the environment out when we've sorted other things out, when we've sorted out the economy. But actually, the things that we need to do to fix the environment, to get back to one planet living, are also things that make people's lives better. Insulating people's homes, having an education that prepares people for life, not just exams, having the first chapter is about a universal basic income so that people can decide how to use their time, energy and talents. So many of us now, how you spend the bulk of your time and your energy and your talents, a boss tells you how to do it. And a lot of us know that bosses actually have really bad ideas, and they're doing lots of really unfortunate, destructive, damaging, disastrous things, damaging for the climate and the environment, and damaging for people. So let's change around. I very much believe in democracy. I believe in people. So let's let people decide for themselves how to spend their time, energy and talents. And, two things about UBI. One is that people say, what would be bad about a universal basic income society? And I probably should. I don't know. Does everyone know what a universal basic income is?
Maybe let's give a quick definition just in case.
Okay, well, it basically means that everyone who's accepted a member of this society gets a payment every week to meet their basic needs. So no one is left not being able to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. What might be bad about that society? Well, there'd probably be a lot of really bad poetry written. People who decide their vocation in life is to be a poet.
And not everyone's vocation is, unfortunately.
Well, no, but, first of all, bad poetry has a really low carbon footprint.
That's true.
Because, sorry bookseller, but, no one wants to buy it, so you don't even have to print it. Most people, if, their poetry wasn't really taking off after a couple of years, would probably go and do something else. But, of course, to be serious, you'd get some wonderful poetry that's not being written now because the would-be, could-be poet is slogging away in one of those horrible call centres where you have to finish every call in 54 seconds and you're timed when you go to the loo. And we all have to ring up and try and deal with those horrible call centres. And, one of the questions is often asked is, well, in a UBI society, how would you get people to do the really horrible jobs? Well, let's imagine sewer cleaning. Of course, when I said this once at a public meeting, someone put their hand up and said, my mate's a sewer cleaner and he loves his job.
I can see that there would be a real satisfaction.
There's nothing more essential to society.
Literally nothing. They are heroes.
But nonetheless, let's assume that most of us don't, as a sort of first thought, fancy being a sewer cleaner. So maybe you'd have to pay people a lot to be sewer cleaners. Maybe you pay sewer cleaners more than you pay bankers. Maybe you should pay sewer cleaners more than you pay bankers.
That's a crazy thought, to think that a sewage worker could be worth more to society than someone who trades stocks 24/7.
Well, there was a moment there during the COVID pandemic where we almost started to grasp
it, didn't it? And I'm glad that you kind of jumped in with UBI because obviously it is overwhelming in the first chapter, and it's such an important part of the green philosophy as well. And as you say, it being able to create so many more artistic endeavors, whether that be good, whether that be bad. But also, some people might say, what about there's a laziness idea with UBI? Oh, people just wouldn't work. No one will go to work. That's a bit of a myth, though, no?
Totally. And in fact, one of the things about this book is that I've been going around for a decade speaking at public meetings, probably an average of 2 public meetings a week, and women's institutes and all kinds of schools and all sorts of places. And so a lot of the stories in the book, I say that the book is co-created because lots of the things in the book are what people told me as we were having discussions like we are this evening. And so one of them is actually from Doncaster. I was with the Skeptics in the Pub, which is a great organisation, highly recommend it. Go and talk about things in a pub. It's a nice idea. But I was talking about UBI, and a guy there, retired guy, put his hand up and said, well, getting a pension's kind of like being sort of like a UBI. And now what I do is on Mondays, I do Men in Sheds. On Tuesdays, I do the Allotment Society. On Wednesdays, I look after the grandkids. On Thursdays, I do this.
And on Fridays, it's Skeptics in the Pub.
And I don't know how I ever found time to do paid work. Another case study for this, again, up in the East End of Glasgow, I was talking about UBI with a wonderful organisation called Gal Gale. Forgive my pronunciation, it's my best effort. But and they work with people with drug and alcohol issues and mental health issues and train them to work with woodwork and make things with recycled wood, etc. And, they were said to me something that just really struck home to me. This community, we have a huge shortage of paid work, but we have no shortage of things that need doing. And, they were really keen to have the idea of they could trial a UBI because then they could just get on with doing the things that were really worth doing and not being chased by the job centre to, we spend 36 hours a week filling in your diary and applying for a whole lot of jobs you're not going to get anyway.
Not to mention, as I think you point out, the benefit system is phenomenally expensive just because of the admin of it. The admin required to make sure that people are going to job interviews, the admin required to make sure that, everyone gets it in the right order, because of the fact that it's only going to a certain set of people and there's criteria that has to be met. So actually you would save a lot of money with UBI.
And the benefits system also means that for lots of people to go and earn more than £5, then you start losing benefits. And then there's all sorts of other things linked to the benefits. And so it actually discourages people from working. And in places like, for example, Finland, where they've trialled it, people first of all can spend time, getting training, getting education, equipping them to work. But also, when their mate says, hey, do you want to come down for a few hours and work on my market stall on a Saturday? You can do that without totally stuffing up your benefits for the next 6 months. And maybe you find you rather like the market stall and maybe you start your own. And if we think about what a UBI would also do, maybe you've done that as a single mum and you've got a great idea for a small business. But now the difficulty of starting your own small business, we know how, many small businesses fail. Income is very uncertain all over the place to start off with. Imagine you're a single mum with a couple of kids. The difficulty of risk you have to take to start your own small business. Whereas in a UBI society, you can do that with the security of knowing you've got that foundation there.
Absolutely, you can. Some skeptics might say, what about inflation? If everyone has £1,000 more, isn't everything just £1,000 more expensive?
Very easy to debunk because it's not that everyone gets £1,000. The only people who get £1,000 more are the people who have zero income now. If you've got 5,000 income now, then you get 5,000 more. The Green Party has had this in our manifestos in various incantations over recent elections. And it's usually somewhere around about £22,000, £25,000 a year is when you stop benefiting, but it's a sliding scale. So one of the things it might do is you think about, I'll be in Hull next week.
Beautiful place.
Definitely. Doing a book event there. There's a wonderful Wrecking Ball music and books. I'll be at Hull then. And... but, places like Hull that rents are very cheap compared to Manchester.
Because it's such a nice place.
Exactly.
Sorry,
but,
Hull.
one of the things that would help to do is if you're an artist, you might choose to go somewhere like that's cheap. And so it would also be having a regenerative because then you could pursue your art. And, we're not talking about luxurious sums of money, but enough to live on. Enough
to give someone decency, enough to give them respectability so that they can pursue what they want to do. And the fact that we don't already have it in place for people who have children is beyond me, given they're literally raising the next generation. But to turn to children and to education, because again, you tackle every single area in this book, education being one where you read it and you think, yeah, why is it that we are putting 5-year-olds literally in a little cage and telling them to focus on a board, give a bit of paper, and all that instinct they have to play and engage, and we just drag that out of them at the age 5? Why are we doing that?
Well, if you think about it, and it's weird because I'm a member of the House of Lords, and so Ed Vaizey, who's a Tory peer, and it's not often that I agree with Tory peers, but I got up and said, well, our education system has essentially not changed since Victorian times. And he got up and said, you've stolen my line. But if you think about it, okay, yes, technology, whiteboards, tablets, sure. But the times which people go to school, the subjects that people study, the exams and the point at which the exams happen. I saw there was times table. The government was getting really exercised about times tables. Particularly under, Michael Gove and that is, well, wouldn't it be great if everyone learnt Latin? And one of the things I promised when I was a fairly strange teenager, but
That somehow doesn't surprise me.
yeah, well, I was in my early teens. I was fascinated by lungfish.
Oh.
Lungfish are
we all have a lungfish period. We do.
Lungfish are absolutely amazing. They're fascinating. Go away if you don't know about them. Go away and look them up. But I've always said that if I'm ever education secretary, I promise I will not make everyone learn about lungfish. And so what we need is an education that prepares people for life. But I mean, there was just figures out yesterday about how many people are being expelled from schools, suspended from schools. And, I went to one of the, academies, infamous academies down in London in the East End at Hackney. And this is a high school. And the pupils must walk along the corridor in single file, in silence. And if they get caught speaking, they will get a detention. If they don't have the right coloured pens, they will get a detention. They basically have to write a self-criticism every day to say what they've done wrong. Or maybe what they've done right, but seems to be mostly focused on what they've done wrong. And, I said how like the Victorian age as this was. This whole structure was created to educate the working class to work in factories. And essentially that's what we're trying to do, is make people fit into, no square pegs here, they're all going in round holes, and they have to fit into that framework. And it's the mental health issues among young people are really related to our schooling. And, schools are set up to compete with each other. So, not having a one-word judgment from Ofsted is a small advance. But still, schools want to get the best pupils so they can get the best results, so they can get the best pupils. And that's so damaging. And teachers are pushed to push out the pupils who are not going to fit into that mould. And it's just not working. What we need is an education for life. Things like everyone should know how to cook food, how to grow food. One of my pet things is first aid. Many of us at some point in our life, knowing what to do when there's a medical emergency is the most important thing you could possibly know. Yet there's almost no education. The occasional school specialty, but especially might, but it's not standard.
I think lots of us will take lifeguarding potentially, but that's the closest that I got at school, which unless you are around a body of water quite regularly, is just not as important as first aid.
Yeah.
But I suppose we are an island nation, so there's more water than in other places, but still.
Well, but the thing is, we're actually not teaching young people to swim.
Well,
and we're actually, every summer we see the tragic results of that. Yeah. With young people, or even, being taught basic water safety. People don't realise that if you, on a hot day and you jump into a cold body of water, literally you can just stop breathing. And, let's teach people that. It would be a really good idea.
Certainly. And I think when you're kind of talking about the Ofsted and with schools as well, but talking as well about universities, because you bring up A-levels and GCSEs, and they used to at least be a little bit of, you could do some coursework there. You could read outside of your subject. You could come up with a new argument. You could come up with a new way of thinking about a subject. You can't do any of that today and get any kind of credit for it.
I think I tell the story. One of the most tragic things I ever heard was a teacher who came to me and who said, I just hate teaching now. I'm going to leave teaching because my A-star pupils, I cannot tell them to read around the subject. I cannot tell them to learn anything extra that's interesting. Every word to get an A-star, every word they write in the exam has to be something that's in the marking schedule. And so I just drum into them what's going to get them marks. And actually, one of these events a couple of months ago now, I had a teacher who was doing GCSE mock exams with her class. And she came up afterwards and virtually sobbed on my shoulder and said, I've just spent the whole of last week doing trial exam papers. And I'm going to spend all of next week doing trial exam papers. And I'm not teaching my pupils anything. And that's doing so much damage to education and damage to people's health and well-being.
And it's stifling people's interest in certain subjects, because in order for an interest to grow, you need to have that level of curiosity and be able to engage with that. And I think a lot of it must come down to universities, because they want to see a study, they want to be able to compare every single pupil. They don't want to have to interview every single pupil. We have this huge university system now whereby basically they want to be able to make sure that everyone's got the right A-levels, everyone's got the right GCSEs, and yet the universities are still having a funding crisis, and they're losing some of the more interesting subjects in order to really focus on employability.
Well, I mean, the universities, the sad reality is we are going to see some universities go broke in the next little while. But universities have been forced to become businesses, to act like businesses. And, we see them chasing after international students because they're the ones that bring in money. And so they build, they spend their money, they borrow to build fancy glass-fronted buildings. And, they get really nice student lounges with more PowerPoints than you possibly think could be conceivably possible. And they advertise these to the students and say, this is what we're giving you. And yet so many of the academic staff are actually on 0 hours contracts, short-term contracts. And, the other thing is also that the universities, I mean, I went to I'll be tactful and I won't name it, but a university...
You can name it here, we can bleep it out.
Oh, that's right. But a medical research place and a medical research institute focused on that. And it was... What's success? Success is making a product, having an idea that can make a spin-out company that can make lots of money for the university and for the individual. And that was the definition of success. It wasn't solving the so many things that we're facing now. It wasn't, understanding something about the human past that really illuminates our present. So many of those humanities subjects, history subjects, languages, for goodness sake. How can we be losing language schools all over the place at all our universities? But it's what's going to bring in the money. And that's what they've been pushed to. And at the same time, we've got young people getting the huge weight of unpayable debt. I mean, the whole student loan system is a fiction. At least 50% of people and 50% of the money will never be paid back, which means it's not really a loan at all. But people will just have, through all those decades of their life, when they normally might think about, settling down, maybe, possibly some places buying a house, maybe having children, then you've just got your salary being dug away at by this loan payment of something you're never actually going to pay back anyway. And yet, by the same token, if you're really rich, mummy or daddy pays your way the whole way along, so you don't have any debt at all, or they pay it off at the end as a graduation present, and your family ends up paying far less money than the people who pay the debt for 30 years with all of the interest.
And actually, this is a theme that comes up. It's much more expensive in this country, in most countries, to be a poor person than it is to be a rich one, because of the fact that we have this kind of cheap, plastic, churn amount economy.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole lot of weight in that. I mean, one of the things, I was actually today with the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission this morning, doing really great work, and they've got a great thing called the Food Conversation. Look out for it, because they're doing events all around the country, citizens' assemblies, talking about what our food system should look like. But, a healthy diet costs 3 times as much as an unhealthy diet in our country, and lots of people can't afford a healthy diet. It's just not in the range. And, combine that with the fact that there's a chicken shop on every corner, particularly outside schools. Combine it with the fact that what's on special, what's being splashed at you, what's 2 for 1 in the supermarket, it's all the ultra-processed food. And more than 50% of British calories come from ultra-processed foods. But it doesn't have to be like that. That's because we've allowed the multinational companies to decide what our food system's like.
And not only is that terrible for our health, but I mean, it's quite, you're a real soil geek, which I love, because we need soil geeks in the world. They're very, very important. It's good that we have soil geeks. It's very, very unstable. And I think many people don't realize how unbelievably unstable our food system currently is.
No, exactly. And one of the things is that so many things are unstable. Our economy, our environment, it's becoming more and more evident by the year as we see fires and floods and droughts and everything else. And, I don't want to be too negative. I'm going to be positive, which is where we are now is profoundly unstable. And that's good news, because the one thing I can guarantee you in 5 or 10 years' time, things are going to look really different and be really different. We are in the age of shocks. I think even when I went into, when I was elected Green Party leader in 2012, if you think back, that was a few years after the financial crash of 2007, 2008. In about 2012, people were still saying, well, when things get back to normal. And if you think about it, I haven't heard anyone say when things get back to normal for a long time now. We are in, actually the original subtitle of this book, through the publication process it changed, but was The Age of Shocks, Common Sense Politics for the Age of Shocks. And those shocks, climate, geopolitical, economic, they're all going to keep coming. And what we need to do is think about resilience. And, to have a genuinely healthy diet in the UK, everyone's heard of 5 a day. Well, it's not the nutritionists who say 5 a day. It was the sociologists, because the nutritionists said 10 a day, and the sociologists said, oh, hang on, people only basically eat 2. If you tell them to go from 2 to 10, it's just not going to happen, and they won't even try. So make it 5, because that's sort of, it sounds achievable. But to actually feed ourselves vegetables and fruit, which we could do, there's no reason why we couldn't grow that ourselves, we'd have to grow about 20 times as much vegetables and fruit as we grow in the UK now. Meantime, if you go into next time you're in the supermarket, Peru, New Zealand, Egypt, Israel, and you'll struggle to find very many things growing here. And yet we're relying on, getting back to the soils again, other people's soils, other people's water. And if you take, for example, Peru, they're growing crops to sell to us from aquifers, underground water supplies, that are been there historically but are not being replenished. So they're literally sucking the water out, and when it's gone, it's gone. We're not going to be able to rely on other people's soil, water, or indeed labour in the future. Why do we do that? We should be feeding ourselves. We could feed ourselves.
We certainly could, and you point out so much, the real war on tidiness, like the lawn, for example, where everyone wants to have a lawn, everyone wants to have a freshly cut lawn. It's, it's unbelievably undiverse when it comes to, as you talk about, when it comes to plant life, when it comes to, animals and bugs and things that can be inside of it. And also, like, whenever you do go to a Sainsbury's, rows and rows of one kind of hedge. I mean, there's so much land we could be using, no?
Well, exactly. And actually, I was actually a ecologist in Sheffield who pointed out to me, if you go into any of those sort of classic light industrial small estates, there'll be some rather dead-looking grass, there'll be an exotic hedge, and there'll be that Mahonica japonica, which is that spiky thing that you basically can't kill. But how about if we were actually planting native, if the rough lawn was wildflowers, is a meadow, and we've lost 98% of our natural meadows. That would be a way we could start to bring the meadows, the wildflowers, great for the pollinators, back. If you put hazel hedges in, wildlife, and native trees, and it would be not marginally any more expensive, and it would look much nicer, and it would be good for the environment. But there's so many things that have just become this industrialised, mechanical, that's what we do, bang, 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 follow the pattern.
Absolutely, and because you touched on actually in the previous answer there, what goes on in Peru, or any part of the world where we import food from, and how this is supposed to be progress because of the fact that they're using all these advanced agricultural methods to industrialize their farming processes, so that we can have all the avocados and all of the, I don't know, what do I usually get that says Moroccan, raspberries and things like that we can have kind of in the moment. But we're actually leaving a huge detrimental effect on these different places.
Exactly, and the other thing is, why do we have supermarkets where you can buy strawberries every day of the year, and you can buy cucumbers in the depths of winter, and you can buy, if you actually had, and going to continental Europe, stores there are much more seasonal. They, radishes, this particular type of radish is in season for a month, and then it disappears and you get something else. And food waste is a huge issue. And there's so much waste in that model. If you're going to have strawberries on the shelf every day and you never run out, it means an awful lot of them are going to rot. And the other thing to say about this is also that Plastic. So much of it is wrapped in plastic. And I once had a row with a man in Waitrose. Okay, I am identifying myself there, but, about why the cucumbers were wrapped in plastic. And he said, well, because they last 5 days longer, so we're stopping food waste. Except, of course, that's because the cucumber is like 15 days old by the time it's been shipped halfway around the world or shipped halfway around the UK and kept in a store, so it's always there. If you just, grew them just outside Manchester, picked them in the morning and they were in the shop in the afternoon, you wouldn't need to wrap them in plastic. And, just while I'm on food waste, I do have to mention that I have fun in the House of Lords. There's something called the long table. So there's a dining room and you go in and you sit beside whoever is the person who's next on the table. And so when I find myself in the midst of some Tories, I have some fun by going, food waste, isn't that terrible? And, everyone agrees that food waste is a terrible thing. That's a really, really easy thing. And then I point out that taking perfectly good food, grains and oils and proteins, and feeding them to animals in factory farms to get a small amount of meat out at the other end is an incredible waste of food, at which point I get some very filthy looks. But, it's quite fun, really.
They must love you in the House of Lords. You must be a fan. Everyone must love sitting next to you.
Well, that's the funny thing, actually, because, everyone will have noticed that we had a change of government quite recently.
Did anyone notice that?
And so usually Jenny, there's two Green peers, Jenny Jones and myself, and actually the Plaid Cymru people who we work with very closely, the Welsh nationalists. And we sort of sit in a little knot. And we used to sit between the Lib Dems and the Labour when Labour was the opposition. We don't have a bench of our own, unfortunately, there's not enough of us. And so, but now, of course, Labour is sitting on the government side, and so we are sitting between the Lib Dems and the Tories, and the number of filthier looks I've had in the last few weeks. And they don't realise I just enjoy it every time. And in fact, someone who shall remain nameless said to me today, "You're in my seat." I went, "No, this is the opposition benches, I'm the opposition. I'm in my seat."
Quite right too. Who was that?
You wouldn't know him anyway.
Well, there you go. Since we've talked about, obviously, the most recent election, it's wonderful. Obviously, the last time that you were with us at Trouble a year ago, the election was a year in the future. We weren't sure. The Greens have quadrupled the number of seats that they have. 4, which is fantastic. What did you think of the election result? Do you think it's a win for the Greens? Did you want to see more?
No, I mean, the practical reality is we were targeting 4 and we won 4, and you couldn't possibly have got a better result than that. But the practical reality, the reasons behind that is we stretched every sinew to be able to fund, particularly, and resource 4 target seats. There's a real problem with money in politics. And, the third chapter in the book talks about democracy. And of course, I talk about the idea of a proportional electoral system. So the number of seats in Parliament matches the number of votes. Every person's vote counts equally. I also talk about how we need to get far less power and resources in Westminster and get it out into Manchester, get it out into individual local communities. But what we also need is much more democracy in general. If you ask me to come and talk about algae, I will probably say that democracy is the solution to your algae problem. Because again, we're sort of doing a bit of a cycle back to the universal basic income. I really believe in human capacity and human ability to solve problems, to creatively find a way through things. But that's not one person. The far right model of leadership is usually a man, very often in a military uniform on a white horse, going, "Right, follow me." Whereas my model of society leadership is saying, "Right, folks, let's all sit down and have a talk and think about what do we want to do and what direction we want to go in, and let's do it together." Now, I believe everyone needs to make politics what they do, not have done to them. If there's one thing you take away from tonight, everyone, please make it go and do politics. Because when I say doing politics, that might mean standing for election, it certainly means voting, but it's much broader than that. Organising a litter pick on your street, getting together with your neighbours to make the world a bit better, that's doing politics. I go into schools a lot and I say in schools, okay, make politics what you do. You can start here in the school. Think of what you don't like about the school and work out how to change it. At which point the teacher invited me, goes, oh God, what have I done? But, a campaign to get less plastic in the school canteen, that's doing politics. And the thing is, once people do that, and if there's one biggest thing that we have to tackle right now, is people sense that politics is not going to change anything, that politics doesn't work, that they're powerless. That is the most dangerous thing we have now, the sense of powerlessness. I mean, Northumbria University did a really good study on universal basic income, where they got some non-political people just off the street, people who weren't at all engaged in politics, and explained UBI to them, and then said, well, what do you reckon? And pretty well universally, people said, yeah, it sounds great, but it's never going to happen because politics doesn't change anything. We have got to address that problem. And it's partly an historical moment because, I'm actually working on my next book because I'm totally mad and I signed a contract with Routledge to write 100,000 words by January. Let's say that really quickly. But
that's a long Christmas you're having.
Well, I've got 50,000 over the summer, so... But, the next book is talking about lots of people whose ideas we should bury. And one of them is Francis Fukuyama, who in the 1990s came up with the thesis of the end of history. So the thesis was, this was after the Berlin Wall came down. And so people had now achieved the pinnacle of human existence, what it was always meant to. How people were living in America in the 1990s was just how everyone was going to live forever in the future. And this was the perfect thing we'd always been meant to get to. And what happened with that taking a lot of hold was that politics wasn't about changing the system anymore. Politics was about who manages the system best. And that's what you were voting on. And we have to get away from the idea that what we've got now is what we've got, and we've just got to manage it as best we can. Humans are creatures of change. And you think about another book I'll recommend is David Graeber, who was the philosopher of the Occupy movement in New York, sadly dead now. He, with David Wenson, wrote a book called The Dawn of Everything. And it's basically about 300,000 years of human history. And the archaeology is now starting to uncover lots of stuff. And just the ways we have lived as human beings on this planet over 300,000 years. There's so many different ways of living, so many different ways of being. The idea that the whole world has to live this one way. And if you think about it now, there's less diversity in the fabric of human life. There's a McDonald's everywhere. There's buildings like the ones around us right now, everywhere in the planet, including places where the climate is wildly unsuited to them. Everyone's got a mobile phone. That's really, we know from ecology that diversity gives you resilience. And we're just homogenising everything. And that's deeply dangerous. And we need to... It's also really boring. Yeah, I was on quite a long train journey through various bits of Europe. And it really struck me how all of the, decent coffee shops in the town centre, in every city, they look the same. You're sitting in this, trendy bare wood, those weird light bulbs where you can see the filaments hanging down. And everything's just all around the world. That's what a posh coffee shop looks like. Please, can we have some more variety?
It's standardization, and it's an ongoing theme throughout everything. And it's because, of course, when everything is standard, someone can make a huge amount of money from mass producing everything, whether that be a coffee shop, whether that be an item of clothing, whether it be at McDonald's. So it's huge business, and you really take down the economy in this book.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, one of the things is that it's also that economic model is causing such enormous environmental damage. And I take the example of, the £5 white T-shirt you can buy in Primark around here somewhere, I'm sure.
Probably see it if you stretch your neck.
Okay, rightio. Yeah, it looks like, the geography looks like that. I thought it was a safe bet. Perhaps it's made from cotton that's grown in Azerbaijan and picked by a child who's forced out of school, so they're not getting an education. Then it's used fossil fuels to ship over to China, where it's spun into yarn and dyed in a factory that's spewing dye straight out into the river. It's then shipped down by fossil fuels again to Bangladesh. People may recall Rana Plaza, the horrendous collapse where more than 1,000, mostly women, died in a factory building they knew was dangerous. probably 12, 14 years ago now. Then it's fossil fuels shipped over to here into a store where a 0 hours contract minimum wage worker sells it to you. The real cost of that £5 t-shirt is vastly more than £5. But of course, this is where, when we come back to why this is called change everything. Let's imagine that you're unemployed, you've got a job interview on Monday and you really badly need that job. You want, a nice crisp white looking t-shirt for the job interview. If you go into Primark and spend £5 and do that, and you've only got £5 in your pocket, the only thing I'm going to say to you as an individual is good luck in the job interview, because you've done what you had to do. And that's what so many people are stuck with no alternative. I'm not concerned at all with individual behaviour. Whatever you can do that's good for the environment, that's good for society, great. But that's not what I'm concerned about. I want to change everything so that the environmentally friendly and socially responsible thing to do is the easiest, cheapest and simplest thing to do. One little story more, sorry, I've always got one more story, but 2006, when I'd first joined the Green Party, and I was out knocking on doors in what I realise now was a very naive way, but green rosette on my lapel, knocked on this door, and I was about to give up, but this little old lady came walking with a stick, obviously really painfully, and it's like, oh dear, I made her suffer to come to the door, and she looked at my green rosette and said, "Recycling!" and very nearly burst into tears, and I'm like, I've made an old lady suffer pain and now she's about to cry. Ah! But she was so upset because she couldn't take her newspapers to the bin, which was 500 metres away, because she couldn't carry them and walk with a stick at the same time. And I said to her then, it's not your fault. It's our fault collectively for not giving you a system it's possible to actually use. And, that's so many things like, the right generally of politics says, this obesity crisis. We have a member of the House of Lords who gets up quite regularly and goes, people should just eat less. And, you've just done a 10-hour working day, and we in the UK have the second longest working hours in Europe. We also have, compared to the rest of Europe, double the commuting time on average. You've just had a miserable 10-hour day. You've had a miserable commute back and forth to work. There's the Tesco Metro shining there at the bus stop. And, donuts are on special. You buy a donut. You buy a box of donuts. We're setting that up for that to happen. And, they make heaps of money out of it. And, there might be some apples in the far back corner if you really go and dig. But actually, lots of corner stores, there won't even be any apples at all. And so what happens?
Absolutely. And you've got to think about the forces who were trying to make us think that it's all about personal responsibility. Yep. Because, it's the responsibility of these huge companies, many of which are owned in huge quantities by a couple of companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, who own pretty much everything.
Yep, in the book I quote, and I've just learnt she's actually got a new book coming out in February of a Canadian academic called Jennifer Clapp, CLAPP, and it was actually University of Sheffield I heard her speak. And if you look at right along the food chain, from the seeds to the fertilisers to the bulk commodity markets to the manufacturers to there might be lots of brands of fast food stores there, but actually they're owned by a handful of companies. And each one of those steps along the chain, there used to be a big six that would control about 80% of the global market in that area. Actually, big six is becoming big five, is becoming big four. But also, as you say, BlackRock owns 10% of each one of those big four at each step along the way. And Vanguard, which is another similar company, owns another 10%. And what the Americans call antitrust, we call anti-competition. There just is no competition anywhere along that line, because the ownership, actually, when you look at it, they all cross-own across everything, and they're not interested in competition or improving their products. They're just interested in getting the maximum lot out of the whole system.
So and when you actually look into the details of it, and the way in which you lay out, it's unbelievably scary. That combined with things like privatization. I mean, what do you think about Labour, for example, and their ideas about Great British Energy, for example? Is it a step in the right direction? Do we need much more of that kind of thinking?
Well, I like the idea of common community public ownership. Absolutely. Where I haven't actually seen the bill was actually published today, and I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But I think everything we'd seen,
forgive you.
Everything we'd seen beforehand said that. But the problem is they're going to have that overarching thing, and then they're going to go to the big multinational companies to actually do it. Whereas what I want to do and very much focus on, and I work a lot with Community Energy England in particular, let's have community energy schemes locally, owned locally, run by local people, and people are very keen to set up local electricity companies. And so you put, you're in this small town, you put a wind turbine on the hill, and you get cheap energy from yourself, and you've decided where to put it. One of the things that we get a lot of resistance now, particularly to wind turbines, because EDF Energy or somebody like that comes along and says, right, we're going to deposit this on you. But how different it would be if the town says, right, well, we want to generate our own energy. We've got, a few rich people in town, and they want to be able to invest their money locally, and then they'll get the money back and they'll spend the money in the town, and that all goes round and round, and it's great. And the scientists tell us that hill's the best possible hill. That hill over there is 3% less energy, but we really value the view over there, whereas we're not so worried about over there. So we're going to put it over there. And that wind turbine's going to actually look different to if EDF has just come and dumped it on top of you. And, that's also, we need strong local economies where money goes round and round. One of the big problems, and, I see this in Greater Manchester, is so much focus and concentration of money and resources in the centre. And there's even, many of the big multinational chain stores here, money will swoosh down to London and quite often swoosh off into the nearest tax haven. And, we were talking about the financial sector. I mean, it was actually a Tory minister just before the election who acknowledged that 40% of the world's dirty money, corrupt money, goes through the City of London and the Crown dependencies, so the offshore little island places. 40% of the world's dirty money. And if you look at an IMF figure, 5% of the world's entire economy is lost to corruption. So that's something like 2% of the world's entire economic value goes through the City of London and the Crown dependencies through our corrupt financial sector. And, one of the fun things I had was we were doing the Economic Crime Bill and the Financial Services and Markets Bill at the same time. And one of the things that I'm afraid both Labour and Tory agree on is that we have to grow our financial sector. And I pointed out that so much of it is corrupt that any growing of the financial sector is massively growing corruption. The bankers opposite me didn't like it. They really didn't like that.
And also, of course, that means it's massively wasteful. And I think, there are two things that I think are really key takeaways from what you've said in this particular book. One is that we can't just have continual growth. That doesn't work. But that scares people.
Yeah, I mean, we've basically been both social democratic consensus and neoliberalism. The idea has been, well, the pie keeps getting bigger, so even the people who are just getting crumbs get a few more crumbs. And that's enough to keep them, if not happy, at least, not wanting to kick over the apple cart. What I would say is, and we as Greens know you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. So what that means is we have to slice the pie up more fairly. And one of the things that I know as a Green, and I focus always on hope, there's enough resources on this planet for us to have a decent life, for us to care for every person on this planet, to care for the climate, to care for nature, if we share the resources out fairly. And that's a very hopeful message. What we have on the other side is the far right, that man in a uniform on a white horse. That message is, it's a difficult, dangerous world. We've got to grab what we can for us and ours and shove those others away, whoever those others are. Build walls to keep them out. Now, politics is divided between those two sides, essentially, now. Centrist politics is dead because centrist politics means leaving things much as they are now. And everyone gets that's just not going to happen, is not feasible. And so people often ask me, how do you know you're going to win? And I don't know that I'm going to win. We're going to win collectively because history's not pre-written. History is made by the actions of people. So that's why, I spend lots of my evenings in rooms like this. No, actually, no. They're not not nearly as nice as this, but in rooms like this in a general sense, saying to people, take it in your own hands. Whatever politics looks like to you, whatever you like doing, whatever fits with you, go out and do that politics. Because, a phrase that I've chanted on many a demonstration, we are the many, they are the few. And that's why I also believe in democracy.
And we don't have it here in the UK. No. Well, I think that's a good place maybe to turn to audience Q&A. So if anybody has a question in the audience, this is the time to ask. Actually, while you're thinking of it, I'm going to ask one more question. And this is slightly unrelated. But you did say at one point that you would like to write a women's history. That's a kind of plan, potentially when change has been achieved.
Yes, when I can retire. Yes, well, and actually this was before politics took over my life. I did actually start a history of the women of London, which was inspired by the fact that when I came to London in 1999, I lived in Thailand for 5 years before that, but coming to London, and I walked around the streets of London and I saw all the blue plaques on the walls, and nearly all the blue plaques were to men. And I said, where are the women of London? And I started looking for them. And there's a poet in the era of Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I, called Isabella Whitney. And I actually randomly in a remainder bookshop picked up a copy of her poems. And so she was the first chapter I wrote. And I'd actually written, it was going to be one book, and then it turned into a four-book series one day. And I wrote about a third of the first one. So there's Isabella Whitney, who's the poet. And she writes this last will and testament where she leaves to London everything that's already there. And it has this wonderful line where she wishes that she was rich enough to be locked up in the debtor's prison. Because you had to have, some wealth, some assets before someone would loan you some money. Which is just, what we were talking about how expensive it is to be poor. And also another one of my characters, which I did write the chapter on, is Moll Cutpurse, who some people may have heard of. She was in 17th century London, and she was basically the Katie Price of 17th century London.
That's saying something.
Yeah, well, she was dressed in men's clothing, which is deeply shocking for the time. She rode a silver-shod horse from Charing Cross to the East End for a £5 dare. And, £5 then is probably like sort of £10,000 now or something. And she was successful, and so she got her £10,000 for doing this deeply, deeply shocking thing.
Of literally riding a horse, wearing men's clothing, and a silver shot. Oh my goodness, easy way to make money back then. Okay, go on then. So obviously you've mentioned a couple figures there. Who would be your dream dinner party then? Go on. If women who've no longer with us from London.
Oh gosh. Well, I'll take those two first. Start off with. There's Bathua Macon, who in round about the Civil War period, before and afterwards, she actually started a school in Tottenham. And she wanted to make sure that her pupils were taught proper stuff. And she taught them Greek and Latin and not dancing and needlework and all that sort of stuff. So Bathua Macon's rather nice. And actually, she'd be just really fascinating. Sir Thomas More, St. Thomas, his wife was actually his second wife was a really amazing, strong-minded character who appears in lots of the men who he dealt with, the scholars who came and stayed at his house, and they really didn't like her because she just didn't put up with any shit. And they weren't used. They were important scholarly men from across Europe, and they were told to behave themselves and wipe their feet and don't bring in treadmill into the house and things like this. And they really didn't like that.
Sounds like a troublesome woman.
Exactly.
Sound like someone we'd be like, well, that sounds like quite a dinner party. Someone else who Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr.
Yep.
She sounded like she did incredible stuff. She was really into literature for women and
Yep.
books. She wrote books, and it was an amazing woman. But it now is simply known as the last of the six wives.
Well, I have to tell you that in the House of Lords, my favourite room is down the end, the Prince's Chamber, which is down the end, one end of the chamber in which we actually sit. And it's my favourite room because it's the only one in the old palace that has more paintings of women than men. But unfortunately, they are Henry's wives. So, quite a few of them got their heads chopped off. But
To be added back later on. I hope they're all not headless in their pictures.
no.
Well, if anyone has any questions, this would be a good time to ask them. Yeah, okay, I'm going to chuck you this mic. Will you come and grab it? Because otherwise no one won't be able to hear what's going on. There you go. You can sit back down. You don't have to.
Okay. I've actually got 3 or 4 questions. I'm trying to choose one just to be clear. So I have a question around, I had experience of this recently in my job where we were sort of trying to do a carbon footprint audit for the company. And sort of working with an external provider that was explaining how the EU regulations were quite stringent and quite clear on how businesses could be compliant, but the UK was still figuring theirs out. It was sort of a post-Brexit sort of we're copying Europe, but we're not quite sure which ones we're going to follow. And obviously there's a lot of criticism of these regulators for ease to greenwash, ease to sort of get away with certain things. But I just wanted to know your thoughts on how much that sort of regulation can hold businesses more to account, can sort of get stricter and make this less of a sort of nice to have, but just a blanket, no, all businesses have to comply.
Well, I mean, I think that your final words were one of the key things is, at the moment, we have lots of voluntary schemes. And actually, just in the last few days, there's been a huge amount of dispute and discussion, because you'll have heard lots of these big multinational companies, the giants, the Googles and that of this world, are saying, we're going to be net zero by 2030 or 20 whatever. What they're very largely relying on is offsetting. And offsetting is a con. For those who don't know, this is the idea that, right, we're going to keep burning lots of fossil fuels, we're going to use massive amounts of electricity, most of which doesn't come from renewable sources, but we're going to pay to plant some trees. Or we're going to pay to see that forest over there in Ecuador doesn't get cut down. Possibly that forest in Ecuador was actually never going to get cut down anyway. Offsetting is a con. And any net zero figure that relies on offsetting is just nonsense. And I mean, actually, gosh, it was at the COP climate talks. I think it was Berlin. It was it would have been about 6-7 years ago. I was listening to DHL, and the boss was saying, "No, we're doing real zero. We are aiming to have, we're set this date, and we're going to have no offsetting." It's not impossible. It can be done, and there are a few companies. But the problem is, of course, whatever you make this all voluntary, the cowboys go, "Oh well, we've bought that Ecuadorian rainforest, so we're all fine," and that is a real problem. And I mean, that whole broader point, what you were saying about regulation. I mean, we are so far behind the EU now in so many regulatory areas. I mean, just before the election, the Chemistry Society, which is not what you call a radical political organisation, just despaired about the EU since we left has banned scores of chemicals, or is on the way to banning scores of chemicals as being just too dangerous to allow them to be used. We haven't done anything about a single one of them. And the Chemistry Society was going, we have to have some regulation. And that is a real problem. And I think, just something I was actually reflecting on today, in the dreadful Grenfell Tower tragedy. And we have to stop. I don't think anyone should be allowed to say the phrase cutting red tape anymore. Because red tape, I mean, actually the Hazards campaign, which is based here in Manchester, I've done a lot of work with them over the years, says better red tape than red bandages. Health and safety at work means people go home in one piece, and that should be a given.
Thank you so much. Great question. I think there was a question just behind me if you want to ask it. Thank you so much. Go for it.
Thank you for your talk, Natalie. In his book, The Good State, the Oxford University philosopher A.C. Graylin looks to ways in which the UK can improve its democracy. One of the ways, amongst many, is to have a clearly written constitution. I don't know if you touch on this in the book, but I'd be interested if you have any thoughts on that.
I do touch on it in the book. In fact, it's quite a big part of the book. And it's also, I had a letter in the FT, and I got into a lot of trouble with their legal commentator, who's a very well-known guy, but because I said there should be and I was reacting to a report that he'd written, and I said there should be a written democratic functional constitution. And, what we have is the result of centuries, I actually said this in the House this week, centuries of historical accident. Except is accident quite the right word? Because somehow or other it's the power goes and resources go to the few. So an example of this is there's a post called the Remembrancer. Now this happened because the city saved Parliament from the King sometime in the 18th century. And as a result of that, the city got a special post of a person who can be allowed on the floor of the House of Commons and sees all legislation before it goes to MPs and can kind of, offer some suggestions. This is the Remembrancer that's a result of an 18th century historical accident who's still there today and means that the City of London has a special representative at the heart of Parliament, that farmers don't have the same kind of representative, nurses don't have the same kind of representative, teachers don't have the same kind of representative, but the City of London has that representative. And back in the 18th century, the City of London kind of represented the middle class of London. It was, for the standards of the time, moderately democratic. Now, because it's the last rotten borough where the votes go to the companies, not to people, and the companies are the financial sector, the City of London operates to promote the financial sector. And the financial sector has this special post there because of accident. But with the FT legal commentator, David Allen, he's got a three-barreled name, I've forgotten his third bit, but he got very upset about what I said and said, well, written constitution is no use because, look around the world, it doesn't protect lots of people. People knowing what the rules are is a very fundamental thing. We don't have written rules, and so, people like Boris Johnson can just drive a cart and horses through whatever they want to do. So, yes, just being written down is not a guarantee, but at least you can see what the rules are supposed to be and you can see when they're being broken. It's a start, but functional and democratic. And, the UK is not a democracy. The current government got 30% of support from the people who voted. If you look at the overall electorate, that's something like 25% of people on the electoral roll. There's the missing millions because we don't have automatic voter registration. There's something like 6 to 8 million people missing off the electoral roll. So we're down to about something like 20% of people who decide the government. That's not a democracy.
Thank you so much. Great question. Do you have any questions on this side? Oh, yeah. Thank you so much.
Can I ask two super quick questions? Sorry, Justin. I know you only got one. I've got four, but I'll hand it back to you after this. In Manchester, we've got a fantastic sort of restaurant called Open Kitchen, which is based at the People's History Museum, that takes waste food and turns it into meals, like a restaurant does. Yeah. But it's not an idea that's sort of caught on beyond that one place in Manchester, and I don't know how many similar places
there is. I mean, there's one in Sheffield. There's one in Leeds. There's a kind of smattering. Perhaps would be a fair label.
Is this the sort of thing you look to as part of a waste reduction? You're supportive of, and how do you envisage rolling that out on a wider basis?
I mean, it's a good idea, and there's an organisation called Fair Share which does a great deal of work taking excess from the supermarkets and distributing it to community centres, Meals on Wheels, all those sorts of things. The problem is that behind a lot of that, and I was actually many years ago now in Brighton, I visited Fair Share in Brighton, and they actually had, coming off a lorry, they had standing trolley after, those standing trolleys they have in supermarkets. 3 or 4 trolleys of those of perfect cauliflowers that if Fair Share hadn't taken them, and Fair Share can only take a tiny fraction of supermarket waste, they would have gone to compost.
Yeah.
And there was also, I'll never forget this, it was just mind-blowing, there was also pallet after pallet of raspberry and blackcurrant fruit juice drink. So you know those things that are like 5% fruit juice, 15% sugar, water.
More sugar than that, I'd say.
Probably, yes. And there was just tray after tray of those, and they hadn't sold, so they dumped them on FareShare. So we need a different kind of food system that doesn't produce that massive amount of waste. And so much gets wasted in the fields because farmers, I do a lot of work on this, farmers, the supermarket has ordered a whole heap of cauliflowers. They're not selling cauliflowers, and they just tell the farmer, no, we don't want them. We're not paying for them. And they're just left to rot. And so the whole system is built in, again, we come back to what I was saying about supermarkets. There's got to be that cauliflower has to be on the shelf every 365 days, every day. There's so much waste built into that system. Those things are great and more power to their elbow. But, how about we have, community gardens dotted around and they're able to, grow the food locally, produce that from the community garden and use that for a community kitchen kind of arrangement.
Okay. And second question, completely unrelated. On UBI, which I think is an absolutely wonderful idea, I think single person's universal credit at the moment is around £4,500 per year, which is quite categorically not actually enough to live on. Yep. If we can't even convince a government to give those out of work enough to meet their basic needs, what figure are we talking about in terms of UBI would you want to see, would you expect to see for somebody to be able to meet their basic needs? And while you answer that, I'll hand this over to Justin.
I think there's someone else.
I won't hand it over to you. Unlucky, you had your shot.
I think, the Green Party has had various goes. We've had fully costed proposals which we've put into our manifestos. What we've had to do to make this work and to get figures that are reasonable, a pure UBI should cover your housing costs as well as your food and your energy and all the rest of it. In the UK, because our housing costs are so ridiculously off the scale, and because they're also hugely diverse around the country, what we did was we separated out housing costs and we kept housing benefit as separate because we just couldn't come at a figure that came at a reasonable figure. We were basically, I think our UBI this time, we in our manifesto lifted universal credit by £40 a week. And so that was taking it up to it's still not enough, but what we've done is produce fully costed manifestos that we've had to find the money for that, as well as lots of other things, investment that desperately needs doing. I would say, an ideal figure would be sort of mid-teens, thousands of pounds per year. But, you get to where you as best can. And one of the interesting things, and I was at the BIAN, is the international, they've just had the conference down in Bath, the Basic Income Earth Network, which is the global organisation that's been going for many years promoting this. And it was at one of their conferences I heard, it's really interesting, New Zealand has a pension that's not contributory. So if you reach pension age in New Zealand, you get what's actually a really decent pension, no matter what you've done with the rest of your life. And what's interesting about that is that New Zealand's had some horrendously neoliberal governments, but they've never been game to attack the pension because this is a benefit that goes to everybody. And everyone has some interest, in knowing they're going to get that. And so that's what I think, if you start at a fairly decent level, there's actually going to be a lot of pressure to increase it, politically speaking. People say sometimes, aren't you concerned it's going to get eaten away at? But actually the New Zealand model shows that it tends to go the other way.
Thank you so much. Great question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk today. It's been really inspiring. My question is around the word community. So you've mentioned a lot of things about like universal benefit income and talking about how the fact that the UK has the highest housing costs and the fact that our working days are the longest and that our commute is the longest and people are tired after work. So this sense of community, especially because I've recently just moved to Manchester, I've really found that it's been lacking, especially in the younger social spaces, that I've been involved in politics for as long as I can remember, since I was a child, and I'm pretty sure I'm similar to you. I've always been very weird and things like that. But so I've always been very involved, and then now I'm an adult, and I feel like I've now got the power to do things. I'm reaching out to people and not receiving many things back, and understandably people are tired, and I myself are tired after work, and I'm commuting 40 minutes to my office job. So it's like, I just wanted to know do you have any steer on how to foster a community in an absolutely exhausted society?
Well, one of the things, which is not an immediate solution for you, but a collective solution, is it's really exciting to see how much traction the 4-day working week as standard campaign has been getting. And this is not talking about what the government's doing, which is compressing 5 days into 4, but a 4-day working week as standard, the 4-day week campaign, is a reduction of 20% in working hours. And, you can actually do it in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be 4 days, but it's basically a 20% reduction in working hours. Because basically the 40-hour week is something that was arrived at a century ago. And, Keynes, the economist, in the 1930s, thought that by the 1970s we'd all be working 15-hour weeks. And that would be the standard working week. But instead, we actually took a reverse turn whereby we got more and more stuff and people have to keep working more and more. And the financial sector kept growing and everything we kept chasing on the treadmill instead of going, let's have more time. No one lies on their deathbed and goes, I wish I spent more time in the office. If we can't keep having economic growth on a finite planet. But if we actually say, well, every year we cut the standard working week by 15 minutes. Every 4 years, you get an extra hour of life every week to do with what you like. So that's the long-term project, and you'll see that, that campaign's getting a lot of traction. That's not going to help you tomorrow. I fully appreciate that. I think it's a case of one of the things to do is to look and find where people are and give them manageable chunks of things they can do. I mean, one of the things I say to, Green parties is, you need to find a starting point that someone joins, but they say, oh, I've got 2 small children and I'm worried about my grandma and I've got to go and visit her and I've got all of this and my job's really demanding. Find people something, a way in. I'm not one of those who's critical of collectivism, so-called. If people can only share 1 tweet a week or sign 1 petition or something, that's something. And what you have to do is give people a ladder that they can just do a little bit more and see the impacts of it. And I think, a litter pick is a great place to start. You can probably get litter pick stick things from the council. If your street needs it, say, drop a note through your neighbours and say, on Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, I'm going to go out for an hour. Kids welcome, do you want to come and join me? Something like that. Or, in groups of young people, maybe just organise a games evening or something like that and just get people together and perhaps as part of that games evening have a little chat about, spend half an hour chatting about what would we like to change about this bit of Manchester? How would we like to do? So I think it's a case of, it can be a big job to take on an enormous, it's like I've seen people go, right, we all have to tackle the climate emergency. It's like, that's just asking a bit much. Make this street a bit cleaner. That's something you can give people somewhere to start. So giving them, and then I often talk about the cleaners at the University of London a few years ago. They had what was called the 3 Cosas campaign, and they were actually nearly all Latin American Spanish speakers. I had to have a translator when I talked to them, and they started campaigning for the London living wage, and they had a huge fight and lots of strikes, lots of action. They finally got it, and instead of going, all right, we've got that now, they went, right, what we want is the 3 cosas, which is Spanish for 3 things, the same conditions for holiday, sick pay and holiday time as the academics have. So they won something and they just went on to the next thing, and they actually got about 2/3 of what they were asking for from that. And they actually then went out and the union that had sort of formed around that went out and they unionised the cycle couriers in London. And if you think of one of the most difficult people to unionise, they're people who are paid by the parcel by companies and they're just like independent contractors. And so the cleaners from the University of London went out and supported the cycle couriers. They didn't even have a language in common, but they went and did it anyway. So, start small and build it up. And the other thing is, look where you can find links once you've built something. Don't say we have to do this on our own. Where's there another organisation in the next suburb that's doing maybe not the same thing, but something similar? And if the two of you can two groups can get together, you'll be much bigger than you are on your own.
Thank you.
And come to Trouble.
Well, of course, yes, sorry, I should have said that.
Do we have any more on this side before we finish? Justin, did you want to ask one more?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Go on. We should need the microphone, otherwise people who watch it later on will be like,
Just dominated. You kind of touched on it just now, but I would be really interested to hear about how the Green Party collaborate with or relate to movements like Extinction Rebellion, like Just Stop Oil, and how, I don't know, they help or don't help. But what's the relationship between the party and those movements?
Well, I mean, we are the party because we aim to get people elected onto local councils, into Westminster. Politics is what we do. That's what the party does. However, you will find an awful lot of local Extinction Rebellion groups that basically look like the local Green Party. There's a very large amount of crossover. And what we've always said as the Green Party is non-violent direct action is often necessary and often successful when you can't get your message across any other way. And, a lovely example from Sheffield, and this also ties into your question about sort of community organising. You might recall a few years ago, there was the Save Sheffield Trees campaign. The council was cutting down huge numbers of street trees in Sheffield. Healthy street trees, no reason to do this. It was a privatisation story. The contractor was making lots more money by cutting down trees. And huge campaign. Lots of people put their body on the line. I mean, I was actually there on a day when we had. It was also quite fun in a weird kind of way. We had there was rabbits and hares and squirrels. So squirrels were people who ran up trees and stuck them there so they couldn't cut the tree down. I can't remember if they were rabbits or hares. One of the two would dive underneath the lorries so they couldn't drive the loggers. Lorries around. And I was there one day, and I mean, this got totally ridiculous. The council has since massively apologised and acknowledged they were entirely in the wrong. We had riot police with helmets and shields, and they were determined to drag this rabbit out from underneath the lorry. And they were trying to get the rabbit to take one of their helmets so they could drag them out without smashing their head. There's also another famous story from this. There was a woman who was playing a sparkly pink recorder, and she got arrested for playing a sparkly pink recorder. Anyway, there was all this huge row, the great news is that Sheffield now has a genuinely world best street tree policy. The council had been so bad and had to admit so much they were in the wrong, and they paid lots of people who were illegally arrested lots of compensation. Now, no council officer brushes up against a tree without checking with the local community group first to make sure it's okay. And with your point about, building community groups and effort, one of the things I love, and I'm quite a positive about social media compared to lots of people, in New Delhi in India, they saw the Sheffield Street Trees campaign and founded their own. Isn't that a lovely good practice, good ideas that just can spread?
Thank you so very much. I think that's a really wonderful place to end. Can we please give Baroness Bennett a really big round of applause? Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we all had many, many other questions, but the most important thing to take away is go and do politics, whatever shape or form that might be in. We do have copies available. We have Charlton Books with us, so thank you so much for being with us. If you want to grab a copy, you can. I'm sure Natalie would be more than happy to sign a couple of copies.
Sign copies, yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to you all for joining us this evening. We have another Trouble event coming up in a couple of weeks. We have 2 in November, which are going to be announced very soon. We have the one with Caitlin Moran in February, which is going to be really, really exciting. So do keep an eye on the Trouble schedule. And thank you so much to you all for joining us this evening. We hope you have a lovely rest of week and weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. much again for joining us. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, well, it was great. It was fantastic to read. It was really lovely reading the book as well on PDF this time, which was really much nicer. Which was really fab. But thank you so much. It's just such a pleasure. Yeah,
Great audience.
I mean, lovely. Yeah, I'm so excited about kind of going through, but about those.
Yes.
It's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg. You have to do the events to get them to come, but you know, just get people over to it. So it's kind of about getting the right balance, and also how much I can physically come up here as well before we start bringing in other hosts to do things like that. But thank you so much. Totally brilliant, right?
Okay, I better go over.
Yes, let's find you a pen. Well, can I get you a drink?
Oh, glass of what?
Yes, of course. Give me 1 second. Sorry, everybody. Can I say, if you took a glass, if you could leave it back on the table over there, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yes, I think this is one of the first things they are going to continue running this, so you can always keep an eye on the schedule.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you enjoyed. Well, good news. You need to get the thank you so much for coming. Good to meet you. So, yeah, it was great to meet you. Thank you so much for
But in terms of community stuff, Manor Church is really good. If you go to Westfield Spring, tell me what sort of thing you're interested in, and I'll be able to find out.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Have you got a card? Or?
No, I have no, you wish. However, I have my partner now, here, which is
I'm a journalism researcher and amazing.
I think I've never seen it. That's fantastic. And did I kind of get a conversation about, you know, what kind of your biggest things that you would say, do you want to go to another drink? Oh, yeah, it's complimentary, so do
She asked those questions and I answered them. She said yes, she enjoyed it. And you might think, you know, with the parents in the background, like, I'm back in the room with two parents sitting there going, yes. So definitely, yeah. So well, you know, actually, it's not that far off. I had some GCSE students who came to read the book. So, you know, it's not, she might find that it's decent bits of that she can walk around. Okay, cheers, thank you. Hello. What's your story about? Okay, well, well, you know, okay, well, there you go. Oh, there you go. Very good. Well, I mean, I actually went to Kyiv about 4 or 5 months after the Russian attack. Yes. It was actually, I went with the European Union because they had the capacity to organise, which we wouldn't have had a capacity to organise on our own. Just because I thought it was really important, and we also met with the Ukrainian Green Party and you know, solidarity. We also went around, you know, the military and went around all of those things. So, you know, that was quite some time ago, but I do know what the experience of being in Kyiv is like.
Yeah.
You We'll have that conversation. All right, definitely. Okay, right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Cheers. Celery's over there.
You take the card, or do I take? I'll take the card.
Okay, right. Oh, that's the first time I've seen that happen. New ways of buying books.
Yeah, do get to know each other. Thank you so much, Maria. Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for coming. I know. Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much for doing that. She's amazing.